Клер Муді. Так? Прошу вас, шановна пані.
Thank you very much, and forgive me if I say a lot of what you've just said as well in the speech that I'm about to make. Firstly, as was said when I was introduced, I am Vice Chair of the European Parliament's Security and Defence Committee. So the issue of women and conflict is one that is very, very close to my heart, and one that I do try to spend a considerable amount of time on in my role on that committee. But also, probably the main reason I'm here is because I am joint chair of the Eastern Partners Euronest Parliamentary Assembly of the Women's Forum that works within that assembly. And actually, we had a key meeting here in Kyiv last October, and it was when the Women, Peace and Security Organization were involved in making that meeting such a success. And it was what I was very pleased to be part of that, but also wanted it not just to be a one-off event, that our engagement with you is an ongoing one from the European Parliament. As has been said, the issue of the particular relevance of women in peace and conflict, well, in conflict situations and peace building after them needs much more attention than it frequently gets. And that's again a reason why I'm very pleased to be here with you today. When you look at every stage of conflict development, you can see within that there are very clear elements of that that are specifically related to gender. In the run-up to conflict, you will frequently see that there is a link to women's role and how central and how much power women have in those societies. You will see that there is a correlation between that and actually the possibility of the development of conflict subsequently. Also, and I fear that many of you in this room may be all too familiar, that there is the impact on women very specifically of gender impacts on women during conflict. We've seen around the world gender-based violence being actually used as a tool of war. We've seen violence against women and girls not just escalating but also being used as a means of subjecting populations to fear and intimidation, specifically through the women of the war who are involved in the war. And that genuinely doesn't end when war and conflict ends either. We've seen too many times again around the world that we have women who are then subjected to practices as a consequence of their gender as well. You are seeing at that point continued violence against women, but you also see a rise in the issue, for example, of trafficking again, that women are particularly subjected to as well. So with the ongoing stages of the conflict, in the run-up to the conflict, how women are treated and respected in the communities, during conflict, where you see specifically gender-based violence, and then subsequent to conflict, where you see those ongoing impacts on women in both in the area of the conflict, but also when you see population moves afterwards, both internally displaced populations, but also in terms of refugee populations. That's specifically on the violence issue around conflict. But there are other impacts as well. There is the impact, the economic impact on women. Now, actually, you can see in conflict-afflicted societies that there can be a raise in the economic empowerment of women at that point. When you see men much more involved in wars as soldiers, in military roles, actually you see women backfilling into those economic roles. And that gives a different position. It is not the way to develop women's economic role in society, but it can in some ways strengthen and develop the role of women in the society. But again, you see beyond the conflict that that is not necessarily a role that is embedded post-conflict, but it can lead to a different perception of women's economic role. But it requires specific, intended action for that economic empowerment to then be embedded and developed subsequently. Another area that suffers as a consequence of conflict is that of education. This is a general population, and a lot of the issues that affect women are, of course, issues that affect the whole population. But it is really important to have a gendered policy response through that process as well. So when you are looking at education subsequent to conflict situations, it is really important that you make sure that women's education is focused on particularly, because the consequences of that, again, are not just for the women involved. It is for the wider role of women in their families too, and the significance and the development, and again, that embedded prosperity that goes on beyond. And then you have the role of women in peace building. There has not been enough work done on the role of women in peace building, but what work has been done has demonstrated that if you have a not just quantitative but qualitative engagement of women in peace building, then it lasts longer. It is already demonstrated, for example, in conflicts around the world, that there is a 2 to 5 year longer period of peace in consequence of women being directly engaged in the peace process. As I say, though, it has to be in that qualitative way, not just in the room, but women taking roles of power and having influence in those peace-building processes. This is, as I say, something that needs to be considered centrally. There are examples, for example, what has been happening in the Colombian peace process, or one that I am very much more familiar with, which is the one of the peace process in Northern Ireland. These are areas where we have seen that integral involvement of women, not just in relation to the militarized zone, if you like, but in relation to the families and the society more generally. So you've got them involved in the informal, in the formal structures, but also it is vital to have women involved in the political structures as well. You can see that in other areas where you have seen a deliberate, intended involvement of women in politics, in the outcome of conflict as well. We've seen that in countries like Rwanda, in Afghanistan, in other countries, where it actually has been significant that the women have been given a percentage of population within the parliaments too, which is really important. Periods of transition allow us an opportunity to break the cycle of women's marginalization in power. But it has to be an active and systemic move to involve women in that power. And it also must not be an afterthought. Women need to be engaged at all levels, from the beginning to the end. The term gender mainstreaming is used a lot, but it actually, the term itself is not the important thing. The important thing is that you involve women in the processes, that they are involved in positions of power, but that when you are planning outcomes, when you are planning processes throughout, you always have in mind what's the gender impact, how can we involve women, how can we bring them on board, and therefore you are involving the whole of your society at that point when you are developing processes. Active, systematic engagement with women, both locally and nationally. And having women in those visible leadership positions. So, gender mainstreaming, involving women, getting the data, bringing women through. As I say, it is the right thing to do in and of itself, but it is also a practical thing to do, ensuring long-term, sustainable peace after periods of conflict. I'm very grateful to have had the chance to talk today, to have the chance to speak to you this morning, but actually the part of the day I'm most looking forward to is the interaction that we will have during this session and beyond, and learning and listening to other participants throughout the rest of today. But thank you for this opportunity, and I look forward to being involved not just today, but also in an ongoing basis into the future. Thank you.
Thank you.